You're listening to the Prescribed Films Podcast Network, home to hundreds of hours of free podcast entertainment. The shows on this network all have a common goal, providing you with the best discussions about movies and other forms of entertainment media. The PFPN hopes to fill your earholes with audio joy. Visit our website with links to all the other amazing shows at www.thepfpn.com. Thanks for listening.
Welcome back to the Story By podcast. Thanks for stopping by. It is Halloween, or near enough. So I opted for a ghost story today. It is inspired by true events, and I'll delve a little more into that after the show. For now, since I made you wait an extra week for this episode, just so it would release around Halloween, I'll just get to the story. Wags, a ghostly tale. I was raised on a literary diet of Daniel Cohen books like Monsters You've Never Heard Of and The Restless Dead. Those orange Crestwood monster books, and of course, Lovecraft, Poe, and King. I was fascinated by stories of the mysterious and unknown, and wanted desperately to believe in them. But my mother the cop and my father the nurse also instilled in me the value of skepticism. So all my favorite spooky stories remained just stories. But a tiny piece of me always wanted to have some sort of brush with the supernatural. After I graduated from high school, I enlisted in the Army. My goal was to serve as an intelligence analyst, but regardless of your specialty, you're a soldier first. This meant I had to make it through basic, and according to my old man, that meant a lot of PT. I wasn't a natural athlete, hadn't played sports, and once I'd left school hadn't given a second thought to the PE classes I'd had to suffer through. So, I started running. The summer was unseasonably warm and humid, even for Iowa, so to keep from dying, I ran after sunset. It might have been cooler to run in the morning, but I had a day job working at the local pharmacy, and I wasn't getting up even earlier to run a couple miles beforehand. The first night, my plan was to just circle the block enough times to get some miles in. That way, if I discovered I was too out of shape, I wouldn't be miles away from home when I gave up. So I headed down the street in front of my parents' house and saw the flare of a cigarette cherry in the dark of the porch 2 houses down. Howard Klein was in his usual spot, sitting in his porch swing, smoking and drinking his evening beer before bed. I had no idea how old Howard was, but in my memory he'd always been retired, had always walked with a limp, and always seemed to have been made of leather. He would also always spend an hour or two on his porch each night, smoke some unfiltered cigarettes, drink 1 can of beer, and watch the neighborhood. His constant companion on these nightly outings was Wags, a stout tank of a mutt with unkempt shadowy gray fur, snaggled teeth, and a puckered starburst scar where his right eye used to be. Howard claimed to have found Wags on the road, brought him home, and nursed him back to health. But from our perspective, Wags had just appeared one day and never left Howard's side. Wags looked like a pieced-together Frankenstein's creature of a dog, and I had seen him back down far larger animals without a single bark. In fact, I don't think I'd ever heard Wags utter a sound. Not a bark, a howl, a yip, not even a throaty growl. But despite his fearsome and frankly ugly countenance, he was actually a fairly skittish animal. If anyone but Howard reached toward him for any reason, he would sidestep away as nimbly as a dancer. I assumed that was a side effect of whatever mistreatment he may have suffered before he came to live with Howard. My little sister, Ava, who had been working her way through my old monster books, claimed it was because if we touched him, we'd realize he was a hellhound. "That's why he always smells funny," she told me with the supreme confidence of a budding adolescent who's just realized she knew everything. "It's the sulfur." He smells funny, I replied, because all he and Howard eat are Franks and beans. This set off a lengthy discussion of farts that doesn't bear repeating. The first night of my run, as I passed their house, Wags popped up from his spot beside Howard and watched me until I disappeared around the corner. I know this because I could hear the jingle of the literal dog tags hanging from Wags's collar. And, from experience, I had seen that Wags's one remaining eye never missed anything. Despite a local leash ordinance, Howard never put Wags on a leash and never tied him up. If Howard walked anywhere, Wags would simply trot along at his side, never bothering passerby, nor chasing animals or cars. Though there were occasional grumbles from nosy neighbors about safety, most of us just accepted Howard's behavior because we all considered Wags harmless. Howard's one concession to neighborhood safety was the installation of a fence around the perimeter of his yard, though I suspect that was more to prevent people from bothering Wags than to protect the population from his hellhound. On my second lap past Howard's, I discovered Wags waiting at the inside of the gate. As before, he silently watched me pass until I was out of sight. On the third lap, I discovered Wags standing outside the gate. As I passed, he fell in beside me, trotting along, keeping pace. If I sped up, he would speed up. If I slowed down, he would, of course, slow down. For the entire lap around the block, he stayed with me, though he was visible only when passing through the pools of light poured by the street lamps. He otherwise seemed to disappear into the darkness between them, though I knew by the sound of his claws clicking on the sidewalk and his jingling dog tags that he never left my side. We circled the block several more times, and Howard waved at each pass or raised his can in salute. When I decided I'd had enough, we slowed our pace, and by the time we'd returned to Howard's gate, we'd eased down to a walk. "All right, Wags, I think I'm done for the night." I opened the gate, Wags trotted through, then turned and looked at me expectantly. "Same time tomorrow?" I asked him. I swear Wags nodded, then turned and bounded up the sidewalk. I closed the gate and stood there as Wags leapt up the steps and hopped back up to his spot on the swing beside Howard. "Thanks for running him," Howard said, his face mostly visible via cigarette cherry, which gave him a flashlight monster at a slumber party glow. "Don't get around like I used to." "Not a problem," I replied. "Gonna keep doing it?" I shrugged, said, "Well, probably till I head off to boot camp." "Mind if Wags comes along?" I kind of get the impression that's Wags's plan. Howard chuckled, coughed, said, "Reckoned he'd be that way. You want any money for it?" I waved away the offer, saying, "I'm going to be running anyway." "Least let me give you a beer for it." I chuckled, said, "I'm only 17. Thanks, though." "Evening, Mr. Klein." I headed for home, a shower, and bed. The next night, Wags sat waiting at the gate, and as I jogged by, he popped up and ran along with me. The clicking of his claws on the sidewalk fell into a rhythm with the slap of my shoes, and we performed a running duet, punctuated by the jingling of his dog tags. I expanded our circuit to a quartet of blocks, and we rounded them repeatedly. Whenever we passed Howard's, we got a wave or a beer salute. Eventually I was done for the night, opened the gate for Wags, said, "Same time tomorrow?" and waited for his nod. Then he trotted up the sidewalk, bounded up the steps, and curled up beside Howard on the swing. Howard patted the mutt with one hand, raised his beer in his other, and said, "Thanks again." I waved back and headed for home. Wags and I kept our routine for several more nights, and I was so accustomed to finding him waiting for our run that I was startled to find Howard waiting at the gate. "Hey, Howard," I said. "Wags okay?" "He's fine. Looking forward to his run. But we got us a problem." He nodded to the house across the street from his. I turned to look at it and saw a figure at the window, apparently watching us. "Mrs. B gunning for Wags again?" Howard nodded, said, "She's seen you boys running, and of course, Wags ain't leashed." "She complained to the city again?" He shook his head. "Not yet, but says she will if she sees you out with him." "Oh, well, I don't want to get you and Wags in trouble." Howard waved away my concern. "She said, if I see that dog loose again, we just won't let her see him. You know that alley that splits the block in half, the one the garbage guys use?" I agreed I did. Most of the blocks in the old part of town had a gravel alleyway that cut through the middle. Aside from allowing the passage of garbage trucks without their constant stops blocking traffic, a lot of properties had a garage at the back that was only accessible through that alley. "Well, I'll let Wags out the back of the house, and he'll meet you at the mouth of the alley. Long as you don't come down the street in front of the house with him, she won't be none the wiser." "Works for me," I replied. Mrs. B, I think the B was for Birkinshaw, was one of those people who seems to feel that someone, somewhere, is getting away with something they shouldn't. She made it her duty to keep an eye on everyone who crossed her path and ensure that the slightest infraction was punished. She and my mother had gone around countless times about Mrs. B wasting police time with calls about children riding bikes on sidewalks, people parking on the wrong side of the street, lawns that were getting too long, and, of course, dogs without leashes. Howard gave me a little salute and headed back toward his house. I turned and waved to Mrs. B, then headed off on my run. I rounded the corner, headed up the block, and Wags appeared at the mouth of the alley. He fell into step beside me, claws clicking, tags jingling, and we went for the first of several joyously defiant runs. Each night, Wags joined me at the alley. We ran until we were nearly exhausted, and I would drop him back off. He would disappear into the shadows in the alley, and I would take one last spin around the block to wave at Howard to let him know his buddy had returned. As far as I know, Mrs. B remained none the wiser. Eventually, of course, it came time for me to depart for boot camp. I went on one last run with Wags, and he seemed almost to be aware that this was our goodbye. When I dropped him at the usual spot, he didn't immediately fade into the darkness of the alley. He stood and looked up at me, as if expecting me to say something. "I'm going away for a while, Wags, but whenever I come back, we'll go running again, yeah?" Wags nodded as if he understood me, gave a blink with his one remaining eye, snorted, then headed down the alley for home. I took a spin around the block to wave at Howard, and found him waiting at the gate. "Hey, Howard."
"Boy,"
he said with a nod.
"Course I guess you're gonna be a man now."
I shrugged.
"Wags ain't really taken to too many people,"
Howard added. I shrugged again, unsure what else to do.
"Means a lot to me, and to him."
He extended a hand. I took it and shook it. I made sure to tell Wags we'd go running whenever I come back. Howard smiled, said,
"What'd he say?"
"Is it a blink or a wink when he does it?" I asked. Whichever it is, that's what he did, followed by a snort.
"Always so damn talkative, ain't he?"
After a chuckle, he added,
"You take care of yourself, boy."
"You too, Mr. Klein. I'll be back before you know it." Before you know it ended up being a couple of years. In the intervening time, I had survived boot camp, AIT, and spent a lot of time sifting through data and writing reports. I had also maintained the running schedule I'd established with Wags. Aside from keeping me fit, it turned out to be a good way to assess, evaluate, and process information, and compose reports in my head. My first night home, I was pulling on my shoes to run when my mother said, "Did anyone tell you about Wags?" "What about him?" "Oh, honey, he passed away a while back." "Oh," I replied, which seemed woefully inadequate, but was the best I could manage. I'd never given any thought to Wags's mortality. Since his arrival at Howard's, he'd seemed like he'd always been there, and I guess I had assumed he always would be. "Howard okay?" "We don't see a lot of him since Wags's passing. He doesn't sit on the porch swing anymore, and only seems to come out now and again to get groceries. Ava stops by to check on him sometimes, and she says he seems okay." "Well, maybe I'll visit him tomorrow," I said, then headed out. It was late October, and both the night and the temperature had fallen. Dead leaves skittered along at my feet like tiny skeletal animals as I started off at a walk. I passed Howard's and looked up at his empty porch swing drifting in the wind. Then I saw a cigarette cherry flare in one of his darkened front windows, and I waved. I have no idea if he waved back or saluted with his beer can, but as I started off, I decided I would definitely check in on him the next day. Then I got into the rhythm of my run and went to see if the town had changed in my absence. Unfortunately, I didn't get over to see Howard the next day like I'd planned. Instead, I spent the day telling my mother's endless parade of sisters that I'm not a spy, I just sort through the stuff spies bring back, that all the states and countries I'd lived in or visited were wonderful, and that, no, I didn't have a girlfriend, without getting into the precise reason why. By the time they'd exhausted their questions, their repeated comments about what a handsome man I was, and my mother's patience, it was dark, and I was ready to run. Ava, now a high schooler and fond of dyeing her hair colors like electric strawberry or neon lime, watched me lace up my shoes. "Mom tell you about Wags?" "Yep. Mrs. B do a happy dance when she found out?" "Probably." I finished my laces, stood, and realized that Ava was twiddling her thumbs. Since she was little, that was usually a sign she had something to say, but couldn't or wouldn't. I nodded at her hands, and she tucked them into her jacket pockets. "Can I ask you a question?" she said. "You just did," I replied with a smile. "Jerk," she said with a matching smile. Then she sobered and said, "You have to promise not to make fun of me. I'm your brother. It is both my right and obligation to mock you at every opportunity." She sighed and said, "Do you believe in ghosts?" "I've never met any," I replied. "Okay, but do you think they're real?" "Ava, do you think you saw a ghost?" She shrugged. "When? Where?" "The other night," she said. "I was going to meet Benji and Lisa, so I went out my bedroom window and was sneaking across the back porch roof when I saw Wags." "You're sure this was after he died?" Ava nodded and said, "Yeah, Mr. Klein had a little funeral for him in his backyard, and we all went to it. This was like a week after that." "And Mr. Klein didn't get another dog? One that looks like Wags?" Ava rolled her eyes and said, "How many one-eyed hellhounds that look like Wags do you think there are?" "Well, fair point," I replied. "I mean, it was dark out, and he was that ugly shadowy gray color, but..." "Well, maybe being this close to Halloween..." "You think he came back?" Ava said excitedly. "No, I meant that maybe you were primed to see something spooky. The whole neighborhood is practically decorated like a haunted house." "I knew you wouldn't believe me," she said with a well-practiced pout. "I didn't say I didn't believe you. I'm just trying to see if there's another explanation." She did not seem convinced. "Look, I'm going to go for a run. I'll think about what you said and see what I come up with, yeah?" "Fine," she sighed at me, then bounded up the stairs to her room. I headed out the door, down the sidewalk, and, out of habit, past Howard's house. He wasn't in his porch swing, and I didn't see a cigarette glow at the window, so I didn't wave. As I reached the corner, I decided to turn and run past Wags's secret rendezvous spot. I glanced down the gravel alleyway, half hoping that Wags would be waiting for me, that we'd travel through the night, shoe slapping, claws clicking, tags jingling, joyously defying again the ever-watchful Mrs. B. That was the first moment when I truly felt Wags's absence. Even when Ava told me about the funeral, it still didn't seem quite real, but as I breezed past the mouth of the alley, I accepted that Wags was really gone. My step faltered for a moment, then I resumed my run, allowing it to distract me from my grief. I continued on for a couple blocks before I was aware of a noise behind me. I stopped, and for a moment I heard a soft padding sound. Then it also stopped. I looked back into the darkness behind me, searching the perimeters of the light the street lamps cast on the ground. I thought I saw movement about 3 lights back, but I couldn't quite... That's when Wags's ghost stepped from the shadows. There was no accompanying jingle of tags or clicking of claws. He just appeared in the circle of light on the ground. Even if I ignored the stout shape, the shadowy fur, the snaggled teeth, there was no mistaking that puckered, starburst scar. "Wags?" I whispered. His single eye narrowed, and he took a silent step forward. I am ashamed to admit it, but so help me, I ran. I ran like a literal hellhound was at my heels. I have probably never run as hard or as fast as I did that autumn night. I couldn't hear Wags over the sound of my feet and my hammering heart, but whenever I risked a glance back, he was there, gaining on me. Driven by panic, I paid no attention to where I was headed, focused as I was on just keeping my feet in motion. Before I realized what I was doing, I had run through the massive brick archway of the Heavenly Rest Cemetery. Startled, I stumbled, tripped, fell, and tumbled to the grass. I rolled, trying not to crack my skull on a gravestone or fall into an open grave. Regaining my feet, I looked back through the entrance down the street, straining my eyes for a glimpse of Wags's ghost. He was gone, if he had ever been there at all. By the time I limped home on my skinned knee, I had convinced myself that I hadn't really seen Wags. Surely he was nothing more than a figment of an imagination more affected by grief than I had realized. I reviewed what I had experienced, reminding myself that I'd heard the creature make no noise as it passed through the night. Wags, though he never barked, was far from quiet. His tags and toes alone made quite a racket. Over the years, I had honed my skeptical perspective. My departure from the small Midwestern town of my youth, combined with the burgeoning internet and time spent reading magazines like Scientific American, Psychology Today, and, well, Skeptic Magazine, had given me a better sense of how easy it was for people to misinterpret data, particularly if they were inclined toward superstitious or supernatural worldview. By the time I had limped upstairs to take a shower, I was sure that I had experienced nothing more unusual than perhaps a grief hallucination, fueled by the unexpectedness of Wags's death and primed by my conversation with Ava. Exhausted, I dragged myself to bed, confident that I had a logical explanation for my experience. I discovered the next night just how wrong I was. Over the years I spent in the Army, I learned that the first few days I was home on leave were never really my own. I was either visited by, or expected to visit, nearly every relative or close family friend in the area. Unfortunately, that meant I wouldn't get over to visit Howard until after dark. And I figured I might as well go for a run first. As I laced up my shoes, Ava said, "You think about what I said?" "Yep," I replied. In fact, so much so that I scared myself. "Really?" I told her about my experience the previous night and the conclusions I had reached. "So you think I was imagining seeing Wags? That he was what did you call it, a grief hallucination?" I shrugged, said, "I can't say what you experienced, but I think that's what happened to me. It seems plausible that you had a similar experience." "I guess," she replied. "You don't sound convinced," I said. "We'll see what you think after your run," she said, then loped up the stairs to her room. I headed out the door, down the sidewalk, and past Howard's house. The house was dark, aside from a light in the back room that Howard had called his study. From what I recalled, it was mostly a place to shelve the seemingly endless piles of books that Howard read, seated on his worn leather couch with Wags curled up beside him. If the light was on when I came back, I'd stop and say hi. At the thought of Wags, I decided to run past our old alleyway rendezvous point. Not because I expected to see his ghost, but to prove that I wouldn't. As I passed, I saw there was no dog, ghostly or otherwise, waiting for me. Reassured that I was neither haunted nor hallucinating, I ran on. I'm not sure what made me turn, but several blocks into my run, I glanced back just in time to see Wags appear in a puddle of street lamp light, then disappear into the darkness again. As before, he made no sounds, no tags, no claws, no nothing. Reason told me that I wasn't being pursued by a ghost, that there was a rational explanation. But primitive survival instinct told reason to stick its rational explanation somewhere uncomfortable. I poured on the speed, and recalling how I'd lost Wags at the cemetery the night before, I aimed to get there again before the phantom hellhound caught me. I practically dove through the archway of heavenly rest, and, as before, ended up on the ground, trying to avoid injuring myself on a gravestone. By the time I'd gotten to my feet and looked around, Wags's ghost had disappeared again. I speculated why he didn't follow me into the cemetery. I recalled at least one old story about a child seeking shelter in a graveyard when pursued by a ghost hound. Apparently the sacred nature of the cemetery had kept the foul creature at bay, or something. But that didn't make any sense. Jokes about his hellhound appearance aside, Wags was as gentle as a kitten. It seemed impossible that even in death he would be considered wicked, profane, or in any way evil enough to fear hallowed ground. "This is ridiculous," I said to myself. Then, aware that I was standing alone in a graveyard at night, I decided I might not be a suitable judge of what is considered ridiculous. But I had also long since given up the idea of objects, beings, or places being either holy or profane. So I had to find another reason why my grief hallucination was stopped by the cemetery entrance. I pondered my experience as I walked back home, eyes and ears alert for a reappearance of my ghostly running companion. The trip was mercifully free of spectral dogs, and, tempting fate, I walked past the alley entrance and found Wags waiting for me. "Wags?"
"Yep,"
said Howard's voice as he stepped from the shadows behind his dog. The two stood together just at the edge of the streetlight glow, the light giving both of them a ghostly tone. I knelt, extended a hand to touch Wags, and he stepped back.
"He's real,"
said Howard. I stood, said, "Ava told me you had a funeral for him." Howard nodded.
"Old Biddy across the street kept raising a fuss about him being loose. Called the cops enough that your mom said they'd have to do something."
"You faked your dog's death rather than put him on a leash?"
"You spent a whole summer running with him. He ever leave your side?"
I shook my head, then said, "Well, other than when I went into the cemetery." Howard nodded, said,
"He won't go in there. Old guy that used to caretake the place did some evil stuff to stray animals he found."
He pointed at his right eye and nodded at Wags. Who knows he's still alive?
Me? You? I think your ma suspects, but she lets it go. Wags is a house dog now. I let him out in the backyard at night, let him run around.
I squinted at Wags. Is he wearing socks?
Shoes,
Howard replied.
Keeps his claws from clicking when he crosses the driveway. I took his tags off, too.
Which explained why Wags was virtually silent when I encountered him. He scared the hell out of me the last couple nights. I thought I was being chased by a ghost. Howard chuckled.
He could use the exercise. I figured you wouldn't mind the company.
Same time tomorrow night? I asked Wags. He winked, or blinked, or whatever it was, and headed off into the dark toward Howard's house. Okay if I tell Ava? I asked Howard. She thinks she saw a ghost too.
She keep a secret?
She'll keep this one. He nodded, extended his hand. I shook it.
Stop by sometime when all the family fussing's done. Maybe bring your sister. Wags would love the company.
Will do, Mr. Klein. He nodded again, then disappeared into the shadows. I revealed Wags's secret to Ava the next morning, and we visited Howard a couple times before I had to head back to base. I ran every night I was home on leave, and Wags was always waiting for me at the alley entrance. We continued the practice every time I returned home. Until, of course, years later, the night that I ran by the alley and Wags wasn't waiting for me. I found Howard sitting on his porch swing, a beer in one hand, a lit cigarette in the other. The space beside him was empty.
Looks like you're running solo now,
Howard said. Anything I can do? Howard shrugged, took a drag on his cigarette.
Had the funeral years ago, so I already had the urn.
He chuckled.
Of course, last time he died, he still chased you all over town. Maybe he will again.
Yeah, you never know, I replied.
You don't, do you?
Howard said. I mentioned during the opening that the story was inspired by true events. Like most similar claims, particularly with supernatural events, this was both true and misleading. There really was a runner, a dog, and a mistaken belief that the dog's ghost followed the runner. However, virtually all the details are my own fictional creation. I've been a long-time listener of Monster Talk, a podcast that describes itself as the science show about monsters. It's hosted by Blake Smith and Dr. Karen Stolzno. If, like me, you have an interest in monsters, the paranormal, and the unusual, I'd recommend you check out the show, and I'll include a couple links in the show notes. Anyway, during an episode entitled Hell Hath No Furry, about the black dog of Bungay, Blake described his own real-life black dog encounter. I contacted him recently and asked him if he would mind if I fictionalized the story, and he graciously agreed to let me do it. Thank you again, Blake. And thank you, dear listener, for stopping by. I really appreciate it. Story by Podcast is a production of Fiddling Around Productions, LLC, copyright 2018. Theme music is provided by The High Crest at thehighcrest.com and used with permission. This episode included the song Medusa by Kevin McLeod, Incompetech.com, and edited by Lewayne L. White, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0 license. Story by Podcast can be found at storybypodcast@gmail.com, facebook.com/storybypodcast, and at storybypodcast on Twitter, and of course wherever you look for podcasts. Story by Podcast is also a member of the Prescribed Films Podcast Network. Check out their other shows at thepfpn.com.